Okay, I think we will make a start, and then anyone who's joining a bit later will just miss a bit of my introduction, which isn't the most important bit anyway. So let's make a start. So yeah, thank you all very much for attending this event. This event is the first event in celebration of South Asian Heritage Month at the University of Bristol. South Asian Heritage Month this year runs from the 18th of July to the 17th of August, and it's now in its third year. So it's only the third iteration of South Asian Heritage Month. The theme for this year is Journeys of Empire. So it's recognizing two major anniversaries. On Monday, it will be the 75-year anniversary of India partition and the creation of Pakistan, later known as East and West Pakistan, even later known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. It's also the 50-year anniversary of the expulsion of Ugandan Asians by Idi Amin. Many of the people who were expelled from Uganda came to Bristol, made huge contributions to civil society and beyond in our city. One such person, Batuk Pandya, worked as an engineer, helped to build the Concorde, and also became the first director of a local hate crime charity called Stand Against Racism and Inequality. Rammohun Roy, who we're going to be hearing lots more about during this event, also made a significant journey of empire himself, coming to Bristol when the Mughal king Akbar II gave Roy the title of Raja to recognize his influence and sent him to England as an unofficial representative. We're going to be hearing lots more from Jawhar, who knows a lot more than I do about Rammohun Roy during the next 45 minutes that we've got together. So I'm very happy to now introduce Jawhar Sircar. Jawhar is a member of Parliament for India who represents the state of West Bengal. He served as an Indian Administrative Service Officer for 41 years and then became deeply involved with civil society. He's been a constant force resisting and opposing illiberal forces on the right of Indian politics, and he's published a number of articles and research papers on cultural, historical, and anthropological subjects for many years, including a fantastic article on Rammohun Roy published by Sage in 2020. During this talk, please feel free to post any questions that you may have using the Q&A button that you can see at the bottom of your screen. There'll be time for Jawhar to answer some of the questions at the end, but you don't need to wait for the end to pose your questions. If something pops into your head during the talk, feel free to pose the question and we'll get to as many as possible. So I'll pass over to Jawhar now to introduce himself and to start the talk. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I guess it's a bright morning. We are here to discuss a person, a character, a historical leader of India who celebrates his 250th birth anniversary. He was born 250 years ago. But to us, what is more important is what happened in India about or more than about 200 years. In other words, we are in the early part of the 21st century, and Rammohun Roy's active period was the early part of the 18th century, 19th century, the early part of the 19th century. So the early part of the 19th century is a fascinating period because this was when the British Empire, it wasn't an empire even then, it would take another 50 years to become an empire, when the British colonies in India were coming more and more under British control. In other words, the contestation for the for the Eastern Isles, or the East Indies as they were called, the contestation for the East Indies by 5 to 6 European powers had given way to a very definitive paramountcy in favor of Britain. Britain had emerged as the sole arbiter of the fate of these hapless people. Now, this was around the time when Rammohun Roy was very active on the Indian scene. Who was this person? And why do we pick him up among the sort of millions of Indians? Yes, we still had millions then even. So we always had a lot of people because we had a lot of area, a very fertile country, vast areas. So anyway, Rammohun Roy stands out as the first modern India. Now that is a very arbitrary title to be according to one individual, but is widely accepted as true. He is modern because of various factors that we shall see as we proceed. India hitherto was in its medieval era, medieval ages. Medieval ages in India meant Muslim rule. And Muslim rule is not the way it's viewed now as very obscurantist, very repressive, very backward, whatever. It wasn't like that. So let's be clear on this, because we shouldn't subscribe to Islamophobia, even though the country that I represent was being governed largely by the Islamic forces. They had brought in some form of order, they had brought in some form of governance, they had a tolerant leadership, and they had intolerant, absolute bigots also. Every religion has. So they also had their fair quota. The India of today that's heading close to authoritarian rule and to what I call the Hindu right would love to believe that they were a pack of tyrants who were fleecing the people all the time, who were whipping around people, followed by British who increased the whipping and pick up and paint a picture that isn't fully real. Anyway, to move on, the British had defeated various Islamic rulers and, of course, a bunch of Indian rulers as well, and had occupied very critical parts of Indian territory. I'm using the term critical parts of Indian territory because they hadn't occupied all of India. The geographical concept that you see out in front of you. But they had occupied substantive parts, and they were moving towards occupying or dominating or controlling the remaining parts until it all became a network, a hodgepodge network called British India. So this is the time when Rammohun Roy arrives at the scene. For the preceding 50 years, when the East India Company went on increasing its trade and profits and sending them back home and adding to the prosperity of Britain, that wasn't really as prosperous as you'd like to imagine. It was relatively far more backward. And its products went that famous. In fact, the fact that they were going all the way to India to fight for Indian products, to grab Indian products, shows and reveals that India had an emporium worth looting. Loot, incidentally, is a word that came into Britain from India. It stands for an Indian word for, well, smash and grab. Smash and grab. So they were here on a mission for getting commodities and products out at any cost. And they were backed by a military force and naval power, both of which were in their nascent stage, but over the next 50 years would establish themselves to be the most prominent one in Europe, whatever be it. So this was the paramount period of, we call it the paramount period, or the period of British paramountcy in India, and they were madly looking around for voices. They couldn't understand the language, the languages. India had as many languages as you can imagine. We still have the Republic of India, which is around 1.4 billion, has 24 recognized languages, okay? And each one has more speakers than, let's say, Scotland. So many times more speakers than Scotland or France. So in this scenario, when they were trying to understand the country, the resources that they had, the people they were set to govern without authority, of course, but they were imposing it with British guns and gunpowder. And part of the gunpowder was made from commodities that they had taken from India. But never mind. So as history rolled on and they were madly looking around for voices, appeared a voice that spoke to them. Rammohun Roy was the first Indian who spoke English reasonably decently by any standards. He learned English, the English way, and he could pause at the right moments as well and let his voice roll. He spoke English and he had a command over the language. Incidentally, an American philosopher of consequence has said he had mastered the language of command. English was at that point of time a language of command. He had command over the language of command. He was communicating with the British rulers. And what was he talking about? Was he talking of profits? Was he talking of losses? Was he talking of nationalism? Well, actually, none of these. He wasn't interested much in the economics. He had made a little pile of money from his own estate, but he wasn't speaking to them on this. He was communicating to them about the pent-up anger, the feelings, the dissatisfaction of the natives of India. Now, why do you go around sending people all over the country trying to find out voices? Comes a man straight to your capital in India, and tells you what to do. So that is a sort of role, and tells you what to do in your language without any interpreter. And in a language in which he often spoke better than most Englishmen. So his first was his command over the English language. He learned it the hard way. But this was not the only language. He had this flair. So he knew several other languages. Even in India, where language remains a major problem, he knew Sanskrit, a very tough language like Latin or Greek, useful for finding out root words. But then he knew Sanskrit, the holy language. He knew Bengali, the language of the eastern part of the continent. He knew Hindi or Hindustani, the language of the Gangetic plains. He knew Urdu, the language akin to Hindustani. He knew Persian, the language of the ruling class. He knew Arabic, the language that guided Islamic theology, Islamic thought. So he knew a host of languages, including a few European languages as well. Okay, it's not as a linguist that we remember Rammohun Roy. We remember him also for the voice that he put forward. He was the first public intellectual. Prior to learning the language, he had learned all about India. He had learned the scriptures. He had translated the scriptures. He had fought with the scriptures in the scriptures. He wasn't satisfied, but he studied them nevertheless. So in a way, he had shades of Martin Luther. He wanted to know the religion first, what its canons were, what its sacerdotal literature spoke about, and then argue why and what he felt was wrong about it. India was steeped in medieval values, in medieval culture, And one of them was to practice blindly what was passed down by priests as the command of God. The command of God that controlled large parts of the world during the Middle Ages extended to India because it was still in its Middle Ages. And one of the most heinous practices, one of the most terrible practices that India had those days was that once a person of consequence died, well, his hand was put on. In India, they are not buried. Hindus are not buried. They are cremated. They are put on a ceremonial fire. Once a person died, his widows jumped into that fire. It's even too horrible to imagine. By Indian standards, by any standards anywhere in the world, but it happened. It happened. And people were not objecting to it because the priesthood had said, this is what God has ordained. You've heard of such practices in Africa, in Latin America, in many other parts of the world. And obviously, the Christians were horrified. They had gone over these stages, but forgetting all along that many of their greats were also put to death under rather painful circumstances. But never mind. Having said so, the fact that this practice was going on, it was known as sati. Sati was going on, horrified most modern Indians. Most Indians who looked forward to rationality, to modern thought. But no one had the guts to take it on because it was supported by the priesthood, imposed by the priesthood, sanctified by religion, and surprisingly enough, supported by the British colony. The British colonial rulers were more interested in making profits, and they had absolutely no business to mess around with religion and to sort of stop inhuman practices. It was not their business. But Rammohun said, it is jolly well your business. If you are going to run this country, if you are going to rule this country, you have to rule it according to rationality, to rational laws. You can't have it this both ways. Sorry. And he convinced Lord Bentinck, after a long, long struggle through 2 or 3 other viceroys, to accept the fact that this is a crime, nothing short of a crime, and this be banned. He remembered all in India's history as a person who broke free from this terrible medieval practice and stopped it. Stopped it. This went on to support things like remarriages of widow, which was considered impossible, which was considered immoral. And Rammohun ushered in the new era where women were concerned. It's not only in women where women were concerned, it's in many other aspects of Hinduism. Now, Hinduism had, at the same time, certain very, very fine philosophies, very, very fine thoughts, and terrible practices that went along with them. So there were 2, 3 layers of Hinduism, and the one that was known as popular practice to Hinduism could have very obnoxious elements, very obnoxious elements. Now, these had shocked Christian missionaries and idolatry, for instance. And then the look and the shape of idols. The look and shape of idols. Now, remember, these idols had been brought up, had been invented, had been crafted to convey some message, a message of terror. So you had a terrifying mother, let's say, and she's supposed to convey terror. She's not supposed to be conveying sweetness to you. But then to a foreigner, this terrible mother was much too terrible to look at. So there are many other things that revolted the British visitors, traders, and others who came in, the missionaries as well. And he joined hands, Rammohun joined hands, and agreed to a large extent of whatever appeared obnoxious to rationality and science and free thought. But he was not willing to become an agent of Christianity. He said, here's a religion that has survived for 5,000 to 7,000 years on the basis of core values. It has survived 500 years of Islamic occupation without cracking out. So it has strong values and it has terrible practices. So all we need to do is to get some of these terrible practices out, because these are not sanctified by religion. These are accretions. These are abominations that have crept in. Hinduism appears to be one of the world's most weird form of polytheism. Polytheism, the worship of many gods. Now, to anyone who's brought up in the Abrahamic tradition of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, would be horrified to come across a religion that sort of talks about many gods with equal breadth. Some of them, as I said, pretty grotesque looking as well. This was abhorrent to the outsider. But then Rammohun Roy got around the task of identifying what he called the true religion. The true religion of India, he said, is monotheistic. It is as monotheistic, as much of a believer in one God, one spirit, one religion as anyone else. So how do you explain so many gods? He said, they are manifestations of different forms, of different desires, of different requirements at different points of time. So he moved towards what we call the monotheistic end of Hinduism. And the religion that he left behind, he actually broke off from Hinduism, a bit like Martin Luther King. And the religion that he left behind is strictly monotheistic. It's actually, as we look at it, it's almost like the church. It's church being a religion. He did create a new religion that emerged out of Hinduism. So that's one major contribution for which we remember him. There are various other contributions for which Rammohun Roy remains very famous. One of them is that he was the first rationalist among Indians. He believed strictly in rationalism and Western science. Now, this was very, very interesting because he was the first Indian to come out and say that we have missed the Industrial Revolution, we have missed the scientific progresses, and while we bandy around our ancient religion and civilization as the best that the world could give, we are missing the bus. That's all. So the way is to hop, step, and jump, to piggyback, and to find our feet in the world by accepting the wealth of Western philosophy, Western science, Western technology, and the Industrial Revolution. So that was very, very bold, as you can realize. That was a very bold statement to be made at that point of time when people were looked upon the British as pure and simple imperialists and moneymakers. But then when education was concerned, as I said, he was a master of theology, Sanskrit. And when the British set up a Sanskrit theological university college, he opposed it. He said, we don't need that anymore. I'm sorry, we don't need it. We need institutions in science and technology. Now, many Indians thought he had gone nuts. Many Indians opposed him as well. But then Rammohun Roy was made of sterner stuff. And the fact that India took on to Western education, took on to Western rationality, took on to Western thought, and retained Indian civilizational thoughts as well, Indian civilization values as well, is one of the major contributions that leaders like Rammohun, and when I say like Rammohun, I mean those who followed Rammohun. He was the first who had contributed. So he was instrumental in setting up many of these colleges and many of these institutions of learning. In addition, he was known for his very strong views on the liberation of women. As an Eastern country, as an Eastern civilization, there were various amounts of doubts about how much liberty women could be given. And Rammohun was always in favor of gender. He was ahead in favor of gender, even far ahead of the West in the early part of the 19th century. He opened up to science and science education. He was the first person to bring in the free press in India, the free press and liberal. So he was actually a very, very enlightened Western leader with an Indian skin, an Indian bearing, and Indian heritage. That is the way I describe Rammohun Roy. And for whatever he took up, he came across severe opposition. He came across severe opposition, and Rammohun Roy was used to opposition. This is which makes him so different. He was used to opposition, and he was used to being pilloried wherever he went. But he fought and fought until he won. So all the values that I've spoken about, and we can start with his views on religious obscurantism, with his views on horrendous practices in religion. We can view his views on women, their place, their rights, the fact that they needed women needed education and equality. He spoke of equality. Remember, when people, the suffragists would be fighting for the next 100 years plus to get equality for women in the West. And he was speaking of equality in India, a place where this sort of a thing was not only not known, but very unfashionable. He first spoke of rationality in a country that did not believe so much in rationality. He spoke of science, he spoke of Western education, he spoke of Christian values as well, various Christian values that needed to be adopted, but not Christianity as a whole. The religion that he founded was very akin to what is called Unitarianism in Christian religion. These are some of the very basic contributions he has made. He reconstructed the Bengali language on the basis of grammar, on the basis of syntax, grammar, and many other things that he could imbibe from the West. He gifted his countrymen with values. He instilled these virtues in them at a time when these were completely foreign and many of them totally unacceptable. So he remains the first Indian, and he looked the British in the eye. In the eye, he spoke from a position of equality, even though he was a subordinate in a colonial setup. He came to England, he came to London to argue in the House of Commons for 2 years, and he died in Bristol, as you know. So that was Rammohun Roy, a princely man, far ahead of his stature. And India is lucky to emerge from the dark age into which it had fallen in the 19th century and the early 20th century, thanks to a whole series of leaders, the first among which is Raja Rammohun Roy. Thank you. Any questions?
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Jawhar, for that enlightening talk. We have had quite a lot of questions in, so I'll just pose the first one. The first question we had was from Naomi. Naomi said, I read that Lord Bentinck only intervened over the practice of sati after Rammohun Roy and Dwarkanath Tagore jointly persuaded him that sati was not an indigenous practice. At that stage, Britain did not want to meddle in religious matters in India in case it jeopardized British trade interests. But learning that sati was not an indigenous practice, meant that Lord Bentinck felt able to act. Is that correct in your opinion?
Absolutely correct. I said something very similar in a shorter phrase. Absolutely correct.
Mm.
And he was instrumental in persuading Bentinck to impose British law to ban it.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to England to ensure that Bentinck's law wasn't upturned, that his law was confirmed by Parliament, because there were forces in British Parliament who felt that it was not Britain's business to meddle around. Let those widows die and jump into the fire and die. What does it matter? So he came to England and he died here.
Thank you. Surinder has asked, what was Roy's background, parents, education?
Well, he was upper caste. He was upper class, but a class that went through financial problems. These stories are quite common in England as well. Manors, the properties that fell into disuse, that properties that had to rise again. So he was drawn into a property class, but the extent of money that he made for his estate was primarily his own. He indulged in trading, he had a lot of economic activities, but by 1810 or thereafter, he gave it all up and used his money for charity, for philanthropy. So he was far ahead of Bill Gates.
Great, thank you. Naomi has asked, did Rammohun Roy ever meet Queen Victoria?
No, not that I know of.
Sure.
They're pretty close in time, but he died in 1833, 32. So, and Queen Victoria was just around at that time.
Mm-hmm.
We have a bit of a timing difference.
Mm-hmm. Surinder has asked, what influenced his views of women, as it was quite unusual for that time?
Oh, men who consider women to be equal are one up in genes. That's all. It's evolution. It can happen anywhere, any part of the world, and you don't need external provocations. We have had lots of Indian leaders who have believed very strongly in the liberation of the Indian woman. So therefore, the picture that you have of Indian women and their rights and their capabilities, that picture is often different from various other parts of the Eastern world.
So I've got a question as well. So you mentioned the Muslim Islamic rule of India and the way this, you kind of touched on the way that that's kind of painted at the moment. Roy was in favor of religious tolerance, had a deep respect for Islam. Do you think that the fact that he was promoting this kind of religious tolerance has an impact on how much his legacy is taught in schools in India today? I'm vaguely aware that there seems to be quite a revisionist approach to history amongst what you described in your talk as the Hindu right. So do you think that's having an impact on the way his legacy is being taught in the country today?
Absolutely. The fact that his first source of inspiration was monotheism of the Abrahamic variety through Islam, not Christianity, through Islam, and that he learned the very fine issues and very fine values of Islam very early, and was very impressed with the monotheism, the strict monotheism of Islam, as against the prevailing polytheistic practices that he saw all around, some of which were pretty bizarre at that time. So this impressed him, and this is one of his, and he had always held this up. And this is one of the reasons why the present regime in India, which isn't fond of considering Islam to be anything good, shies away from him, shies away from the first. it shies away from its moral responsibility of accepting the first modern Indian, which is not good.
Thank you. So you mentioned in your talk about Roy's commitment to English education. I think you described him as being one of the first kind of Indian people who had this command. You could describe it as the command of the language of command. And that seems to have, this kind of commitment to learning English, teaching English, sparked a debate many years after Roy's death between Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. And Gandhi seems to have objected to Roy's commitment to the teaching of English and characterized him as a pygmy. He described him as a pygmy. What are your thoughts on that, and kind of why that view was taken by Gandhi?
Well, in a way, the teaching of English and the English instructional schools, colleges, English. I use the term Western philosophy, Western ways of thought, Western rationality had people in India who could never stomach it. Had people in India who could never stomach it, who felt that it was a bit, well, and it did create a new class. So we can't deny that as well. It did create a class that benefited from it, and a class that prospered, and a class that distanced itself from its native soil. That part must remember. So by the time we have Tagore and Gandhi quarreling on many issues, one of the issues was that this class that had been brought up 3-4 generations had learned English and imbibed the English way of looking at the world, were completely detached from Indian reality. So Gandhi's complaint was very real. They were getting more and more detached. In fact, one of the complaints of the Hindu right is that liberal, democratic, plural ideas in India are the locked up property of the English-speaking elite, are something that the English-speaking elite cherishes. Yes, of course we cherish it, but they feel that it's a byproduct of that sort of education and privilege. I underline privilege. So they have this class thing coming up as well. Strong class views on what should be done.
Great, thank you. You touched in the beginning of your talk on, I can see some other questions have come through, so I'll let other people who have been posting questions have the opportunity to have theirs answered as well. So Naomi said that Gandhi did come to accept that Rabindranath Tagore was correct and Rammohun Roy was not a pygmy. Okay, that's a nice, that's nice that they kind of ended up agreeing about the legacy of Roy. Akhil has said the resting place of Rammohun Roy in Bristol is not really known to the masses in India. For a person who has made such great impact on modern India, would it not be appropriate to give a bit more significance to that sacred place?
Surely, I fully accept the charge. The India that followed should have the India that was based on liberal values, on plural tolerance, and ruled this country for the next 60 years after independence, should have taken more care to recharge these values. And the India that has slipped into the hands of those who don't believe in these values would not perhaps be expected to come and do this end of the duty. It is underplayed. Rammohun is underplayed, and one of the reasons is a bit of angst against him. Why on earth did you leave Hinduism? So that sort of a thing remains, you know. Why on earth did you have to? I mean, we all accepted you. We all said that whatever you're saying is correct. Why did you have to leave? Why did you have to leave? You know, it's a collective sort of a memory that people had, because the rest of Hinduism picked up the Rammohun's way of thought and became as liberal, in fact, more liberal, more liberated over the next 100 years. So they turned around and said, for God's sake, why did you have to split the religion? So that sort of an angst was there, I think. That's all. Otherwise, Rammohun remains undoubtedly the first tall leader. And the next one who follows him comes 20 years after him. After which we get a series coming every 5 years.
We have a question from Surinder, who's asked, what was his life in Bristol like? And she's also said, I live in the house he stayed in, so that would be interesting to know.
Oh. In fact, I haven't made a very serious journey of Bristol. I should. I've been there, but we need to sort of own up. You know, history is something that you may like, or somebody's views you may like or not like, but he's there as part of your patrimony. So you start to don't pluck out a part and say, no, you don't belong to me. So India's going through its cataclysm, and the new India that will emerge after all these negative thoughts are dealt with will surely be better.
Mm-hmm. And do you know much about his life when he was living in Bristol? You may be aware that we have a statue of him outside the local government building in the Central Library. There's a statue of him. There's a bust also in the local council. Have you got a sense of, because obviously he had a big impact because there's a statue of him in the middle of the city. Do you have a sense of what he was doing when he lived in Bristol?
Oh, I can put you on to people who know far, far better than this. People who made a research of their lifetime on what he did in Bristol. Mm. There's lots of people. I mean, one of my scholars is in England right now. She's teaching in Oxford. Alaska, to get in touch with you and to put you on to that part.
Yeah, that would be great.
So that part is very well known. It's all documented. Maybe you could sort of hold back. I mean, maybe you could utilize that part to popularize Rammohun's Bristol connection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've got one last question before we wrap up. I can see that we've answered all of the questions from the audience. Just in terms of just going back to what you were saying at the beginning of the talk, just for a few seconds, if you could just talk a little bit about just the fact that obviously the British East India Company were in Bengal at the moment. So what were they doing there? And you kind of mentioned that the wealth of, for example, like the materials that would be being used for gunpowder was being taken from Bengal. I think the reason I'm asking this question in particular is because I think there's definitely movements in this country trying to paint colonial activity in India as something that was a positive thing for the country. So it would be good to get a sense from you about what they were doing there. Were they there to plunder the wealth of India? Was it something that was positive, or was it something that was overwhelmingly a negative thing for India and for Bengal?
It was positively a negative thing. So oxymoron, positively a negative thing. They were here on someone else's land, making brother fight against brother, or saying that, well, brothers were fighting against brothers and we were intervening. It's none of your business, number one. Number two, they were here on a mission of extraction. Extraction of wealth at any cost. At any cost. At any cost. And any cost meant human life as well. They were here supported by a military force that was more mercenary. They were here dumping their useless aristocrats as governors and governor-generals and sending off the ne'er-do-wells, packing them off in the ships to lord around people on the strength of their skin and their bellies or whatever. And red coats, they were miserable in those woolens in India and died in considerable numbers. Lord be with them. But then we have lots of graves. They were here on a mission that was not not commendable by any fault. It's like saying, looking back at West Africa and saying that, oh, we liberated you slaves. Slavery was such a lovely thing, wasn't it? It's like the British occupation by the Germans, which you resisted, fought a whole bloody war. So it's like saying that, what's wrong about it? I mean, if Germany wants to occupy Britain, what's wrong about it? What's wrong about it? It's one of the most stupid ideas to even say that colonialism, occupation of somebody else's land, killing other people, extracting gold at any cost, doping the whole world with drugs, opium, made from one country to the other, an extraction of wealth and living off the prosperity of others is such a nice thing because there were byproducts. We taught you a language. Why to keep it back? We'll gift wrap it and send it back to you. Don't worry. But never mind. History is history. What's gone on is on. But if you bring in value judgments, I have given you a slice of my mind. So, and that's exactly the way Indians feel. That's exactly the way Indians feel. They have none of these, oh, what a nice thing it was. That is the imagination. You see, far from apologizing, far from considering it one of those historic mistakes that has happened, and should not have happened, that sort of a thing. There is the school. It's as bad as the Hindu right fascists who feel that, oh, we did the right thing and we'll continue to do the right thing. Slaughtering humans for fun. It's great fun. I mean, it isn't on. It isn't on. Remember Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood? So we always have nutcases. With every 52 cards, they send you 2 jokers. In India, the number's gone up. That's all.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jawhar, for that fascinating talk. Thank you, everyone, for attending and posing really interesting questions. The talk has been recorded, so if you would like to access it afterwards, I'll send it around to everyone that had signed up. But yeah.
And do something about those broken off parts.
Yes.
And wish your students and faculty all the very best. All the very best. We are now in the 75th year of our independence from British rule. We have made giant progresses, and we are about to plonk someone we know to a seat, you know. So we are on this self-respect mission. That's all. That's all. We weren't that bad even then. It's how you painted us. That's all. So all the best. All the best.
Thank you very much, Jawhar.
Thank
you, everyone, for attending. Right.